One night in Makassar. There's an old, rusted-out cargo ship beached on the grimy shore of Makassar harbor. You can see it almost anywhere along the rim. I think I first spotted it from a hotel I stayed in when I first came to live there, but it's also possible my initial sighting was during a boat ride out to the little islands that dot the coast beside the city before work started up. When I rode or walked from the apartment I ended up renting to the school where I taught English in the afternoons, I would catch glimpses of it between the hulks of old industrial buildings and storehouses along the waterfront, peeking like the corpse of some rotten whale from above the faint thrum of filthy, lapping water. It was large enough that it towered over any of the more modest buildings, and its bunker-like silhouette sloped crooked in the mire of dingy sand and muck mounded up about its stranded hull. There were many shoddy shacks and rushed constructions that close to the shore, with squatters and the poor scrabbling to make shelter anywhere the port workers wouldn't shoo them off, but they all steered well clear of the beached hulk. There were no shanty towns on stilts in the wreck's shadow, and unlike the abandoned construction projects further inland, I never saw any of the homeless milling about to sleep and talk in its shade. The few who dared to walk that lonely section of filthy beach it occupied gave it a wide berth, and seemed almost to watch it as they went, as if experience had taught them that something might emerge from it and give chase. Just as I can't say with certainty when I first laid eyes on the old ship, I also cannot explain why the thing ensnared me with such a total fascination. I'd ask co-workers about the boat and how it had come to rest there, or ply the staff at bars and restaurants near the water for details on the hulk. Foreigners like me seemed never to know any more than I did. The locals I talked to either changed the subject or simply dismissed it as yet another symptom of poor management, with either the company or the city government, the culprit depending upon the slant of the speaker, being said to have failed to scrap or haul off the eyesore after its operator went under. Yet still, I watched it whenever it leered out at me from between buildings along the harbor front. Still I wondered about it when the wind tugged storms off the sea, and the lightning cast the dark stretch of coast around the wreck in its icy, transient glow. I remained interested but ignorant right up until Kodic came into contact with me. He was in his last year of high school, just a few years younger than I was at the time, and his mother and father had saved up money to hire me on as a private tutor for him. They were far from wealthy, with their whole clan having moved down from the jungle-choked mountains of Upper Sulawesi together just over a decade prior to find work in the city. They spoke even less of the Indonesian national language than I did. They communicated mainly in Totali, a language native to the hills farther north, and dealt mostly with their own kindred, for the Javanese, Chinese, and other Malay folk who mostly peopled the city of Makassar often wanted little to do with them. Even more importantly, their philosophies were different than most of the people around Makassar. Back home, early adulthood had fast taught me that urban populations quickly devolve into a sort of illusion of immortality. Whether it's the divorce from open spaces or the sheer weight of numbers in a given metropolitan area that causes this, I cannot say, but those that have dwelt there longest seem convinced that laws and crowds and the weight of watching witnesses means they are wholly immune to the consequences of their actions during social discourse. They shoulder through crowds and speak out of turn among strangers or hurl insults across streets when they feel insulted, seemingly forgetting that they are flesh and bone, and that their skulls could be hoven in by stones well before any police officer or witness might intervene. A writer of pulps once opined that a barbarian or frontiersman is more civil than a civilized man, because he has lived a rough life which constantly reminds him of his mortality, and while capable of crass manners or open violence, he remembers that he is mortal, and only makes enemies when he must. The urbanite, who has never seen the blood of the animals he eats in his dinners, and has never felt the exhaustion born of fear for tomorrow, is in a sense a perpetual child, and he lives his days freely willing to screech at passers-by as if they are his parents, and will treat him gently. So strong is the lull of those environments that the shootings, stabbings, and robberies common to such metropolitan sprawls do nothing to rupture the atmosphere that infects the locals. I suppose it could be argued everyone in the post-industrial world, regardless of how urbane their environment, is slowly sleepwalking into a similar haze of complacency. But the urbanites certainly have the worst of it, and Makassar is one of the largest sprawls in Indonesia. Most of the population of Makassar, like the urbane populations that packed cities back home, were seemingly incapable of genuine conversation or connection not hidden behind irony or hostility. Whether you were native to the streets or hailed from far away, there were very few real friends or connections to be had, making the teeming hive that was the city a paradoxically lonely place. Kodic, by contrast, showed none of this icy detachment from his place in the world, a trait I'd soon learn he shared with all of his clan who'd come down into the city for work. He was talkative, not wholly obsessed with material gain or future business prospects, and spoke a grammatically broken but wholly comprehensible English he'd taught himself through the consumption of media that bordered on fluency. This, along with a keen mind, made tutoring him easy, and before long he didn't need me at all. But even when the lessons stopped, we continued to fish with his brothers on the waters off the coast, and I continued to listen to the vivid stories the older members of the family told of their homeland in the north. As I've said, they communicated mostly in Totali, and my Indonesian was useless among the eldest of them. But Kodic and his brothers would translate, and I would ask. Given my fascination with the hulk upon the shore, and the fact that the clan's rough-built stilt houses stood only several hundred yards from the looming mass of rust, it should come as no surprise that we talked of the aging ship quite often. But all in the clan were hesitant to say much about it. Even Kodic, who was quick to shoot down some of the older folk tales of his grandparents as mere superstition as the first traces of urban materialism crept in to grip him, seemed uncomfortable whenever the topic shifted to the wreck upshore. The details they let slip were rushed and whispered, as if, in some strange way, the clan thought the hulk was listening in on them from afar, as if they did not wish to be heard. The family said that people had squatted in the ruin once, years prior, when Kodic's clan had first come down from the hills to live and work in Makassar. These squatters had lived up on the higher decks and eked out spaces in the old crew quarters and engine housing there. They too had been a group of families from the north, like so many of the others in the slipshod dwellings along the coast. But something had happened to this particular group of squatters, something no one in Kodic's family seemed willing to talk about in detail. This something had entailed the disappearance of all those who'd lived aboard the beached hauler. Drunks, vagrants, and those prone to walks along the refuse-shrouded shoreline began to disappear when they failed to make it indoors before nightfall, and strange lights and sounds were ascribed to an unseen threat that dwelt in the bowels of the aging ship. There had been unrest among the other squatters, and illegal weapons were bought by those who lived in the seaside shanties that hugged the corpse boat's long shadow, in order to defend against a threat they would not openly discuss. The Makassar police had intervened, but more to quell the growing unease and seize illicit guns than to search for the missing who'd dwelt in the ruins of the ship. Indeed, Kodic's family seemed uncertain there had ever been a search of the rusting hulk, for the police seemed to share the squatters' wariness about it, and beyond putting up signs declaring entry was dangerous, seemed largely to ignore the wreck. The Northerners were prone to running small shops without licenses and peddling fortune-telling and pickpocketing scams on the Javanese locals, and the police had little love for them. With time, brutal raids and harsh action by the Metropolitan Police had quelled the riotous frenzy of the migrants, but the squatting Northerners themselves held that the real reason the beachfront slums had fallen quiet was that the lights, noises, and disappearances had ceased. After a month of unseen threats and half-glimpsed glimmers, the rusty metal mountain at the core of their community had fallen silent and dark again. It had remained so for over a decade now. Even so, whole rows of the shacks closest to the hulk had been disassembled and reassembled farther away, and those who traveled into the city for work almost always tried to make it back home before sundown or after sunrise, as schedules allowed. Kodic had been no more than 3 or 4 when this month of tense chaos had occurred, and yet he seemed even more reticent than any of the others. I guessed he had been menaced at such a vulnerable age by all the commotion and whispers of disappearances, and tried my best to leave the subject alone after I plumbed what vague details I could from his elder brothers and parents. Still, the amateur folklorist in me remained fascinated by the ship, and I continued to stare long at it from afar, tracing the movements of the squatters who so steadily avoided its shadows near dusk. One evening, a few months after my first conversations with Kodic's clan concerning the hulk, a storm rolled in off the sea. This was a common enough occurrence for the region, but the storm itself was unusually fierce, and the lightning it dragged in with it painted the roiling clouds and the equally turbulent waves beneath in vivid purples and blues. Even an hour before true sunset, it was black as midnight, and rumbling javelins of electricity were dancing off the roofs and antennae of the taller buildings in Makassar. But the rain lingered, lurking as a dark sheet somewhere far off over the bay as the edges of the storm did their work. I was seated with Kodic and his brothers, along with some smaller cousins, on the rough-hewn wooden porch of the one-room stilt shack they all occupied, the group of us having been driven in from the bay by the arrival of the clouds on the horizon an hour earlier. We watched as the city braced for a long night beneath the clouds, and smoked cheap cigarettes that the wind chewed through faster than we could. That bluster off the sea was so great that the squealing tin roofs of the squatters' settlement drowned out all conversation, and barring the odd shout to one another over the din to comment on some particularly vivid spear of lightning, we spoke not a word. A finger of that lightning struck out and rattled the old hulk of the ship, little more than a black silhouette down the beach before the storm illuminated it, and the ensuing tremors rattled pots and door frames across the shanty town. The rain finally began, all at once, in a single thunderous sheet, and the drumming of it on the leaky tin awning over our heads deafened us even to shouts among ourselves. The noise of the city was eaten away, and after a particularly cruel rumble of thunder, the whole of the waterfront and every visible building further inland went dark, as a power outage swept the whole of the city. Makassar was prone to such outages, though they were generally brief, but to have the whole city seemingly knocked out at once was far from regular, and as the minutes ticked by, none of the banished lights returned. As our eyes adjusted, the swirling clouds and night-black air occasionally streaked by searing bolts of lightning became all the more beautiful, It was almost hypnotic, the storm that surrounded us, and the more I watched, the less I worried about the surf's swell drawing nearer to the feet of the stilt hut on whose porch I sat. The less I worried about the wind threatening to rip the shrieking roof off, or the torrential rain causing flooding in the city's always troubled drainage systems. My companions seemed equally enthralled, for Kodic and his kin had fallen entirely still and silent, and his parents and grandparents had pushed out onto the porch with us to soak in the sights. Some aging matriarch in the ranks loosed a loud cry about how they should have never moved down from the mountains, but hers were the only words for quite some time. The rain and wind lashed, and we, along with almost everyone else in the shanty town with windows or covered porches to see from, watched on over the open bay. I think now that they watched with more reason than I. The terrible force of the tropical storm was enough to take me by awestruck surprise, but even these migrant highlanders from further inland on the massive island had surely seen the like of it before. No, their concern was for other, less speakable things they had long feared through myth, and to which they had been reintroduced more than a decade ago, when the strangeness around the hulk had first come and gone. Kodic, just to my right, muttered something amidst the cacophony. I leaned in, assuming he had been talking to me, asking what he'd said. He repeated, saying this was just like the storm that had started it all back when he was a boy. He was tense, wound up into a hunch in the plastic chairs we occupied, his eyes narrowed at a group of several dozen men, sprinting up the beach through the downpour, who'd been caught out by the premature darkness brought on by the storm. All of them seemed on edge, I realized now, and not just about roof damage or a slight rise in the water. The distant core of the blackened city rang with the muffled sirens of police and glittered with the flashing of their lights between lightning strikes, as units scurried to clear clogged intersections in the dark. I recall a few flashlights and lighters flickering to life in other shacks along the sand streets of the shanty town, but no such illumination was brought out on Kodic's porch. Indeed, the clan seemed shocked and agitated that others would light them, and called out in vain through the cacophony of rain and thunder for them to be put out. All this I absorbed, the strange tension in the air growing by the second as whispers and the cries of children were devoured by the whipping wind and wet. A pair of the runners from down the beach peeled off from the main body of the group as it came into the settlement and approached the ladder up to the shack we occupied. They were uncles of Kodic's, men who worked the shipyards up the shore, and were babbling in Totali, only a few words of which I picked up. Something about the abandoned ship, I thought, and perhaps about someone having died. Another flash of lightning hit the bay, and some of the gathered clan, Kodic among them, fell instantly silent. The others, even the babbling new arrivals who'd had their backs to the water, responded in kind. The eldest of the family began retreating into the house, their wide eyes cast towards the distant ship, moving carefully, as if afraid of causing a commotion even amidst all that awful noise. The younger in the ranks followed suit, often shepherded along by parents or grandparents. Kodic and his brothers pushed me along with them, and before long had passed, I was inside with the 32 members of the clan that shared the large shack. The familiar interior was barren and entirely functional. It was mostly hammocks and sleeping mats clustered around a cooking pit, where the family meals of rice and fish were made. It was not uncommon to come in any time of day and see 10 or 12 of the families seated on the floor around it, taking food and coffee. Now it was an alien environment, host only to the staid hush of frightened people, and the tumultuous rumble of the storm on the tin roof. Some huddled in the center, and others pressed up against the walls. Kodic took a position near one of the front windows, and I crouched down beside him, uncertain what was happening, but trusting they knew something I didn't. Time passed, slow and monotonous beneath the chorus of thunder. Eventually, as the dark world beyond the window came into better focus and the pair of us watched on with his brothers at our backs, I asked Kodic what he had seen. He did not speak in turn. He seemed startled at the breaking of the silence, even if it came in the form of a whisper that was only half audible beneath the onslaught of the rain. Still he answered, lifting a hand and motioning out over the sand in the direction of a tall shack several rows down, where the shanty town came closest to the water. The waves were now well under the houses there, the surf breaking on the stilts and spraying the walls with foam that flared white in the murk. Between the slipshod structures that groaned in the wind off the sea, I saw that there were lights dancing around in the windows of one of the houses there, as the people within moved flashlights to and fro in the dark brought on by the outage. At first, nothing else leapt out at me. The waves roiling out past the vague shapes of shacks were black and angry with the swells off the storm, and the only thing which gave them shape was the froth along the crests. And yet soon my straining eyes did see something that shattered my nerve more totally than any errant lightning strike, and rendered me just as mute as were all those around me. I glimpsed it initially as a series of ropes or spires emerging from the water and probing the bottoms of some of the huts there. I guessed these were trees or debris bobbing in the swelling water, but the youth of the storm and the fluidity of the shapes as they writhed and twitched spasmodically in the dark told me they were something else, something of flesh. They seemed to follow in the wake of a great shape that slunk low in the waist-deep water in that quarter of the shanty town, gelatinous and prone to squeezing tight through beams and trash mounds in the water as if it were a construct of boneless rubber. It was the size of the largest of the squatters' dwellings, and the thing's thick limbs, for I now had no doubt the probing feelers slapping up against the huts were limbs, had a span of 100 feet or more. It was so large that the black, water-slickened flesh of it was difficult to discern from swells in the rolling waves creeping upshore, even after one had sighted it. This was the thing which had once hidden in the ship up the beach, I knew. The thing which the ramshackle village was so hesitant to acknowledge, and no wonder. It was a thing of seeming impossibility, an octopus or some other tentacled beast of vague shape and bleak shifting colors. Swollen to such dimensions it seemed a thing of fable or myth. And yet there it was, ripping from rusted hinges the scrap door of the slipshod hut where the flashlight glowed as it clung to the bottom of the building's stilt platform, like a massive leech to raw flesh. Its meaty tendrils probed windows and splintered wood, as if the shack were an oyster it sought to shell. Lightning struck somewhere off over the city proper, casting the bay in its milky light for a blinding second, and illuminating the flailing limbs of several occupants as they were dragged out and under to where their attacker hung and undulated with the motion of the hunt. I saw its eye painted vivid by the bolt, massive, yellow, vacant, and then all fell to shadow once more. The flashlight bearer who had, perhaps, doomed his household was the last to go that I saw. A beam from another house in the row came to life and cast parts of the shifting mass of blubber into better view. Gunshots rang out, sharply familiar to my ear even amidst the storm, as some illegal weaponry missed by the state's sweeps of the shanties laid into the creature from several homes sharing the row with it. but it seemed unfazed, and lingered only a moment on the husk of the hut it had emptied, before moving on to search out the source of the beam and gunshots which had raked it. After its meal of dozens, it did not seem inclined to slow. Again it latched itself to the underbelly of one of the huts after slinking low like a tide pool lurker through the surf, and again it fed well on those inside, any screams or sounds of struggle beyond gunfire lost in the sonic tangle beyond our hideaway. But the action was largely out of our view. The haphazard nature of the squatters' housing meant there were now buildings obstructing us where before there hadn't been, and the carnage was a thing of half-glimpsed motions and flying debris rather than fully realized horror. But as its second attack drew to a close, and it fell down into the dark water again to move for more prey, there came a loud crash far out over the bay, nothing like the thunder which rolled so ferociously from above Makassar proper. This was a solid sound, one of impact, like a great thump that rattled the huts of the slum on their stilts, and left all of us rattled with the low vibration of the impact. This meant that, loud as the newborn night was, it was felt more than heard, and yet I know in my soul it was the sound that caused the rattling and low quaking across the harbor front. As if called, the thing seemed to hesitate, and in a flash of motion mostly hidden beneath water which should have been too shallow to hide it, the monster which had fed so wrathfully withdrew back along the beach, hugging the roughest of the surf. I watched with Kodic and his brothers, all of us stone still, as it clambered up the side of the hulk. Though the lighting was too poor and the distance was too great to see in detail, I could tell the flesh of the beast shifted to the rusty reds and oranges of the hull as it climbed, lending it a new hue as it began to compress itself into a man-sized hole along the landward side of the wreck. The water, even more so than usual, was deep around the bottom of the hulk tonight. The lowest bowels of the ship were always filled with the turgid tide pools left by the high tides, and now even more was flooded. It would have plenty of space to hide in there, I thought, squashed up in the halls and bays of the ship, digesting the meat it had won. But it didn't have time to get inside. A second, titanic thump rang out somewhere over, or perhaps under, the water, and shook every one of us to our cores. There was a strange flash out to sea, I saw. So focused on the slaughter had I been during the first thud that I think it likely, looking back, the flash accompanied the thump both times. It was greenish, perhaps turquoise, though it's impossible to tell how much of the tint was given it by the water. It was unbelievably strong, as if a vast pool light had been flicked on miles out to sea, and then flicked off again a second after. There was no spear cast down from the heavens towards the sea. It was undeniable. It had come from beneath the surface. The silhouette of the monster shuddered visibly at the second coming of the sound, and halted its retreat into the ship. It sank back down into the surf again, almost reluctant, but this time it did not make for the slum. It simply sank out of sight and did not re-emerge, the last of its many arms being the final part of it we saw from land, sinking into the tumult. For some reason, my mind summoned the image of a scolded child, sulking on its way back home. It was headed for deeper water, I realized, going back into the deeper parts of the bay. Returning, I thought, though I knew not why. A third thud rumbled up from the deeps out there a few agonizing moments later. Again came the flash beneath the distant ocean, and again came the aftershocks that shook the beach. Another second, and the lights flickered on in the high-rises and beachfront industrial centers across the water, and soon after the rest of Makassar, an electric wave sweeping its shuddering way across the metropolis. The sole light in the center of the ceiling overhead flickered into humming life as the siphoned power in the slum came back into motion. I looked over to Kodic, sheepish and uncertain, but found his tiny grandmother leaned over between us to peer out the dingy window, her approach having been stone silent. Her eyes were narrowed, cast out towards the sea, catching occasionally the flash of lightning as the rain began to slowly ease its onslaught, and the noise of the city beyond the slum drifted back in to reach us. There was fear there, yes, but it was a fear of comprehension rather than of wild amazement. I knew in that moment that she knew, at least on some level, what the thing had been, and that her apprehension was all the greater for it. It was her, along with one of her even more elderly sisters, who ordered some of the men out of the house to check the shattered dwellings closest to the water for survivors, where a group of onlookers and searchers from the other shacks was already gathering. Those of us who did not join them came out onto the porch once more to better observe the storm. Several calls were made to authorities, but the reports were of wind and surf shattering the homes, for no one was under any illusions that the Makassar police would take anything but the most mundane tale seriously coming from the squatters. Indeed, I stayed on several hours before heading home myself without seeing any official searchers arrive. It was fully 2 days later before anyone was sent down with a boat to sweep the bay for those who'd supposedly been swept away, and by that time, the extended clans of those who'd been taken had already made their peace. Those hours after the attack were surreal, talking with an array of faces that came and went as people dropped by to share news and ask after friends from across the shanty town. As midnight drew on, and people returned to their modest dwellings and fell into contemplative silence, it seemed everyone looked out over the water from whatever vantage their homes offered them. But there came no more thumps and flashes from far out near the mouth of the bay, and the clouds, so impenetrable just hours prior, seemed finally to be making way for the waxing moon. When at last it was just Kodic and his brothers outside with me, they told me things about how Totali myth allowed that their clans had come up into the mountains in days of old because of clashes with creatures, devils as they put it, from the sea. They were like men, so far as the legends described them, at least cunning and cruel as men. The forms they took seemed to shift from family to family, with some tales describing the sea devils as hideous fish-like merfolk, and others claiming they sported shells and stalks like snails. The actual exodus from the sea was thousands of years gone, and when the clans had lived up in their mountains, the tales of the sea devils served to keep the young close to home, and instill in them a mistrust of those tribes who lived down along the coast. Back when they had lived in their highland towns, the more modern-minded of the squatters had thought them mere useful myths fabricated for just that purpose, to paint their seafaring lowland opponents in war as something alien and grotesque. And yet now, as they dwelt in the vile urban press with so many other groups from around the island of Sulawesi, the youngsters in Kodic's clan had realized even the sea people had their myths about sea devils. It seemed a universal cycle of legends on the island when one left the glow of electric lights behind them and drew out into the countryside, where old ways lingered and older stories survived, whether the tellers hailed from mountain or from sandy cove. Kodic told me of how these sea devils were said to live in cities beneath the muck of the sea bottom, and how, in days of old, They were said to have come in seasonal cycles to probe the shoreline, their objectives uncertain. They brought with them great beasts capable of breaking whole villages or devouring canoes whole. War could not be brought to them, for their beasts of war were beyond the power of spear and arrow to tame, and their cities beneath the waves could not be besieged or burned. But the sea devils were creatures of solitude and secrecy, and much as they reviled mankind, they had become a rare sight in the days of mass maritime travel, industry, and recreation, preferring the staid, quiet blackness of the sea bottom to any raid or plunder from the surface. During the first spate of disappearances when his clan had arrived those years ago, the beast the squatters had caught glimpse of now and then was much smaller, its many arms perhaps the length of 2 men, but its shifting skin and scuttling speed, even over land, making it a devastating hunter nonetheless. It had dwelt, so they all believed, in the darkest bowels of the ship, which stayed flooded even in summer drought. It had all ended during a storm, one Kodic's older brothers remembered more vividly than he, when the very same sort of submarine thunder and lightning had been sent up from far out to sea, and the beast in the hulk had departed under cover of darkness. They theorized now, as they gathered their wits and tried to regain some semblance of normalcy after the madness we'd witnessed, that the hunter had returned to the sheltered pool of its birth, slipping in before the storm ever arrived, using the darkened bay as the clouds rolled in to make good its cautious approach. Perhaps, Kodic shuddered, it had come home to breed, and had come forth to win food for itself from the huts after its business was done in the hulk. But whatever its aim had been, its masters, the real threat, had called it home before more horror could be wrought. Far from comforting them, this seemed almost the worst aspect of what had happened that night, and they refused to speculate further on it, even amongst themselves. I had no idea what to make of this legend, sordid as it was, but the fantastic nature of what I'd seen that night made me much more amenable than I'd otherwise have been. I still don't know. The belayed search for survivors of the supposedly natural tragedy in the ramshackle beachside slum was, of course, fruitless, and the city was back to normal before the week was out, the migrants from the mountains having always been a sequestered, isolated bunch. But more impactful on me than the city's silence was the squatters' reaction, for many clans left in the wake of the second coming of that thing to Makassar, fearing it had left spawn in the hulk that watched over them from farther down the trash-choked beach. Kodic's clan waited into the next season, until he was accepted into a university in Makassar, and landed a job at a travel office. They ensured he was situated in housing far from the waterfront before they too left, and in their wake, only a few families remained in the shacks which had once teemed to bursting along the murky shoreline just outside Makassar. We continued to meet for meals now and then after that, but the fishing stopped. I had no more taste for the ocean, and it seemed Kodic shared my loathing, the deep-seated hatred of his highland kindred for the sea having at last taken hold of him. I left the following year, glad to be rid of the salt stink of the coastal wind, the vile heat and the viler crush of city street and chattering crowd. And yet still, years on, my mind lingers in crags and crevices upon the seafloor which I will never see, and I pray I am incorrect about what I know must dwell there.